1 in 7 people are affected by neglected tropical diseases. That's more than the population of Europe and the US combined. Some kill. Many others cause debilitation and suffering at a collective scale that makes malaria look tame. So, what are these terrible diseases that you've never heard of? Ranging from horrendous worm infections that slowly destroy vital organs or cause blindness, through to the fastest spreading disease today, dengue fever. Neglected tropical diseases are transmitted either by flies or mosquitoes, or simple lack of water and sanitation. They point to a history of systematic neglect of people, not diseases. And the lens must be widened from our narrow perspective. Neglected people exist worldwide, from poor communities in Africa and Asia to the slums of cities in the Americas. This neglect can be addressed. Cost-effective and manageable treatments and vector control solutions already exist. The level of public support and funding needed do not. Eliminating neglected tropical diseases is critical to eliminating poverty. With over 600 million children living in areas where these diseases are intensively transmitted, this limits not only the children's potential, but their entire communities. Conflict and population displacement ramp up disease transmission. Destruction across Syria has created the perfect breeding ground for sandflies and the disease that their bite transmits, turning a once obscure disease that causes terrible disfigurement, leishmaniasis, into a regional epidemic with hundreds of thousands of cases. The responses required are often simple, but in order to break the cycle of neglect, we must first prioritise those that have been and are being forgotten. So good morning, thank you for having me. Some call me the reality checker. We've been working in emergency settings around the world for 16 years as the Mentor Initiative. I've been working in them for 35 years, which sometimes shocks me. Can't possibly be 35 years. And we work heavily with private sector whilst doing a humanitarian job in 9 different countries at the moment. And why do we work with private sector and UN departments that specialize in new tools development? It's because we rely on certain tools to do our jobs. And without those tools, we simply can't do our jobs. So getting tools that work in the settings where those tools have to work in order to be useful for the diseases that they are targeting is a real skill set. I come from an Oxford University background in malaria. I worked in target research for vaccines and diagnostics before going into the field. And my perspective has not changed. It's just become infinitely more informed and practical. So we live in an incredible age of technology and egos. Technology, where it's really easy to get carried away with very clever ideas. And trying to get reality checks into place is hard against a background which is very, very driven academically and very driven by domestic market demands rather than overseas tropical medicine demands. But most disease does not occur in Britain. It occurs outside of the comfortable settings and health systems we work in. And of course, when you go to settings like this, your whole perspective changes in terms of what's real and what's possible. We have done a lot of work on malaria diagnostics and development around malaria diagnostics over the last 16 years. I was at WHO for 3 years as the emergencies coordinator when rollback malaria first got started. And a lot of time I spent was with private sector organizations to create the first tool sets for these settings. We forget sometimes we're not just dealing with individuals. We are dealing with an awful lot of individuals when we're working overseas in difficult settings. And many of the tools that you and I might have access to in this country when we get sick are absolutely irrelevant when faced with a sea of people in the worst situations where disease is most abundant. So when we're dealing with neglected tropical diseases of any sort, you mustn't think that it's a niche market. It's a mass market for those who are affected. And so we work all the way across the war zone in Syria. We work with one disease, and that's building capacity to recognize, identify, and treat leishmaniasis, cutaneous and visceral. And we work with 180 health facilities, and we work with 4.5 million people at their homes level to achieve some form of control. What's really important here is to understand scale. In this setting, a vast number of people can be infected at one time. And when we began in 2013, it was 200,000 people estimated to have cutaneous leishmaniasis. Visceral leishmaniasis, nobody had a clue. But there was no diagnosis available on the ground other than clinical. And anybody who's worked in clinical will know that clinical doesn't work for visceral leishmaniasis at all. So when we get our clever heads on and we go to that space rocket, it's really easy to come up with some very, very clever ideas for diagnosing disease. And we know they can be infinitesimally accurate. But are they appropriate? You know, I grew up in labs with PCR and all sorts of other technology. Is it appropriate? Can you put it in a van? Can you really take it to that mass of people in that context? And will it work when you get there? They're very big questions. Practical solutions that are simple and that work. They're very different from what we see in the laboratories and many of the commercial company laboratories that are key as partners to developing tools that work in the field. This is our mobile lab. We run them all across Aleppo and Idlib and Homs and all the different areas that are affected by bombing where leishmaniasis abounds. It's simple. It's a microscope. It's not very good, but it works. It's complicated in the sense that you need to be a technician, but it's the best we've got. Is that good enough? No, of course it isn't. What should we have is something that's much, much simpler to use, doesn't require the technical skills level, and can be used on greater mass. But it's the best we've got, rather than the electron microscope or PCR in the back of a van. Quite a few years ago now, Gates asked us to help them think through the impact of having proper diagnosis for malaria. What would that do to change the world of malaria? How many lives could that save? Well, having been in WHO for 3 years, I knew how catastrophic the capacity of WHO was to actually diagnose and confirm, for surveillance purposes, the number of malaria cases in the world, when all was done by clinical diagnosis, pretty much up until the mid-2000s. And in the global monitoring program that was set up, 3 heads of that program rotated through in the 3 years I was there, because each one was confounded and gave up. Has that changed? Yes, it has, enormously, because we've now got out of some of this work that contributed to it, with Gates pushing very effectively on commercial companies to make practical solutions. We showed that you could save the lives of many hundreds of thousands of children every year if you could diagnose timely and then inform treatment. And this Nature paper really helped push that along in a practical way. And we ended up with commercial companies competing not on a test design, but on test specificity, on test practicality, on test cost. And now this is probably universally the most used testing system for a tropical disease worldwide. It's simple, it's a rapid diagnostic test. And it really is the gold standard. We used to say that about microscopy. This is the gold standard that we have to strive to reach for all practical testing of diseases in the field. Simple, at point of delivery testing that is simple to train other people with. Why? Because you get very low quality health workers and sometimes no health workers. They may be administrators and logisticians and even car mechanics doing health in places like Syria because everybody else is gone. So we have to be able to train them. They have to be sensitive and specific to the diseases you're looking for. And I'm afraid that's not 60%. That's not 70%. That means, like the malaria tests, they've got to be in the 90%, because you don't want to be wasting 40% of your drugs or misdiagnosing cases and therefore treating them wrongly, because that's called malpractice, it's called maltreatment. So getting it up to 90% of sensitivity and specificity is about good basic medical practice. And they must be affordable. What does affordable mean? Well, it's not $20 a patient. It really means well less than $1 per person for each disease you're diagnosing. And that's really a hard challenge for many commercial companies to get to. And of course it means they've got to get to some scale. And when they get to scale, they find their marketplace, as in the malaria test manufacturers do today, selling millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of rapid diagnostic tests at 55 pence or 55 cents a test. There's a basic rule in public health that the diagnosis can't cost more than the treatment. It should be about the same for children if you wanted to get to public health levels. And really, we have to get to the point whereby it is accessible. And that means you can take the diagnosis tool to the very lowest levels of the health system. You can store it in real field conditions. It won't fall apart and lose its sensitivity and specificity if it reaches 30 degrees. Because outside of England, I have to tell you, well, we don't know, the last month it's been quite hot. But outside of England, it gets hotter than 30 degrees. And in most of the places we work, it's somewhere closer to 40. And it must produce a result there and then, when the patient is in front of you, not tomorrow, not in 3 hours' time. Because many of the diseases we deal with, they have their pathological impact much faster than that. You risk the lives of people if you can't diagnose and treat. You also may only have one single time point for having that patient in front of you. In many of the settings we operate in, we know we'll see somebody once and never again. Even in development settings, that's often true. They may have walked for 5-10 kilometers to get to you. So being practical with a test that is accurate, specific, simple to train others with, and which delivers results within a very short time frame, and we're talking minutes, whilst the patient is in front of you, informs the treatment strategy for that health worker and matches with some of the simplest treatments we've generated over the last 15 years to put into blister packs and one-time treatments, because the two together not only save lives, but they help us to track disease and make surveillance meaningful. Thank you.